I remember the exact moment my life turned from a quiet routine of widowed solitude into something darker, something I never imagined would happen to me. A father who had spent his years shaping minds in a classroom and then shaping the soil in his small rented garden patch after retirement. It was not a dramatic phone call or a medical diagnosis that did it, not the sort of thing people brace themselves for, but rather a sentence delivered in the same calm voice I once trusted to call me Dad. My son, the only child I ever had, looked me in the eye across a polished oak table in a house that I had helped him buy and said words I never thought possible. "You are no longer our father." They were not shouted, not even trembled with anger. They were spoken with the cool efficiency of someone ending a business contract, the tone of a banker declining a loan application. That is how my story begins, not with death or illness, but with a carefully chosen set of words meant to sever blood as if it were paper and not flesh. And those words have burned into my mind every night since, replaying in the silence of my room until I wondered if perhaps my heart might finally give out under the weight of them. Before that moment, my days were marked by small rituals that carried the taste of memory more than of life itself. At 76 years old, my mornings began with the sound of the kettle whistling on the old electric stove in the kitchen of my rented bungalow, a modest place on the edge of town that smelled faintly of cedar when the sun warmed the walls. I lived alone there, surrounded by books, old photographs, and the ghost of my wife, Maria, who had left this world nearly 12 years earlier. She had been the great love of my life, my anchor through decades of teaching high school English, my partner in the raising of our son Craig. And when she died after a long illness, I found that the silence of the house could sometimes roar louder than any storm. I poured my grief into gardening, tending roses and tomatoes with the same discipline I once gave to grading essays, and I filled my evenings with rereadings of novels whose endings I already knew by heart. I told myself that this was enough, that the modest pension from teaching and the careful savings Maria and I had guarded for years were enough to keep me in quiet dignity until the end. What I did not tell myself, but what I always knew, was that all of this would have meant nothing if not for the one bond that remained: my son. Craig had been my pride since the day he first wrapped his tiny hand around my finger in the hospital. I was not a perfect father, but I was present, attentive, and strict in the way that teachers often are, believing that structure and standards are the greatest gifts one can give a child. Maria would sometimes tell me to soften, to let Craig stumble without rushing in with correction, but I wanted him to be strong, prepared for a world that I knew could be merciless. Through his boyhood, I taught him how to hold a bat, how to change a tire, how to read poetry aloud so that the rhythm carried meaning beyond the words. When he left for college, I stood taller than I ever had, not because of what I had done, but because of what he might become. And when he returned, degree in hand, with a young woman named Lynn, who soon became his wife, I believed my life had entered its second harvest, the time when the seeds planted decades earlier blossom into the comfort of family gatherings, Sunday dinners, and the laughter of grandchildren echoing in my living room. But family life did not unfold as Maria and I had once imagined it. Lynn, my daughter-in-law, was always polite but distant, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. And though I made every effort to welcome her, I always sensed that she considered me an intrusion into the life she wanted with Craig. Still, when the grandchildren came, two bright-eyed boys who carried my chin and their mother's dark hair, I felt renewed. I babysat, I drove them to Little League. I told them bedtime stories in the very same voice I once used to read Shakespeare to restless teenagers in my classroom. For a time, there was warmth, and I believed that whatever distance existed between me and Lynn would be outweighed by the bond I had with my son and his children. That belief kept me moving forward, Even when Maria's death hollowed me out, even when nights stretched into long hours of loneliness where her side of the bed remained cold, I told myself, at least I have Craig. At least I have my family. The house that became the setting for my undoing was not mine, though in many ways it should have been. Years after Maria's passing, Craig and Lynn approached me with plans to buy a larger place in the suburbs, a house with enough bedrooms for the boys and a study for Craig, who was building a career in finance that demanded appearances of success. They did not have enough for the down payment, and so they turned to me. I did not hesitate. I took nearly half of what Maria and I had saved across a lifetime and wrote the check, not as a loan, but as a gift, telling myself that this was what fathers do, that the house would be a living monument to the love Maria and I had poured into our son. Craig assured me my name would be on the deed, that I would always have a place there, that the house was as much mine as it was theirs. I signed the documents they placed before me, not reading them with the scrutiny of a lawyer, but with the trust of a father. Trust is what destroyed me. From that day, my visits to their new home became less frequent, less welcome. At first, there were excuses, busy weekends, the boys' schedules, Craig's long hours at work. When I did come by, Lynn would look at her watch as if calculating the moment I would leave, and Craig, though polite, seemed distracted, already halfway back into the world of his spreadsheets and clients. I told myself it was normal, that children grow into their own lives, that I should not cling. But each time I sat alone in my bungalow afterward, staring at the empty chair across from mine, I felt a small erosion inside me, as if the years I had given, the sacrifices I had made, were being worn away, grain by grain. By the time Craig called me to talk at the house that Saturday morning, I was hungry for any sign that I still belonged. I arrived early, dressed in the one good jacket Maria had once said made me look like a professor, my hands trembling slightly as I carried a bottle of wine I had saved for a family dinner that never happened. The boys were not there. Lynn said they were at practice. The living room, bright with modern furniture and the cold scent of lavender air freshener, did not feel like a place I had any part in building. Craig gestured for me to sit, his face unreadable, and then he delivered the sentence that has carved itself into my bones. "You are no longer our father." I thought at first it was a cruel joke, a test of some kind, but when I looked to Lynn, I saw only satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this moment. My son did not falter, did not soften, and as he explained that I had become a toxic presence, that my old-fashioned expectations were a burden, I realized that the years of distance had been leading here, to this deliberate severing. My life, once defined by the role of father, was being rewritten in front of me, and I was powerless to stop it. When I left their house that morning after hearing those words, I did not walk as much as drift. Like a man who has just been told he is no longer needed on earth and is now wandering through the streets waiting for gravity to reclaim him, I remember the air had that brittle crispness of early spring, the kind that usually stirs in me a faint hope of renewal. Yet every gust felt like a slap across my face, as if the world itself were mocking me for being foolish enough to think that blood ties could not be severed by convenience. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The polished table, the legal-looking folder Craig had kept at his side, the way Lynn's lips tightened with each of my protests. And finally, the sentence, cold and surgical, that I was no longer a father to them. It seemed absurd in the moment, almost theatrical, as though they were reading from a script written by some lawyer who had never known me. But the longer I thought about it, the more I realized they had rehearsed this. They had sat together in that immaculate kitchen, perhaps the night before, and decided how to deliver the blow so it would sound definitive, professional, and irreversible. I was not meant to argue. I was meant to accept. That was their mistake, for they forgot that the old teacher they had dismissed still knew how to listen between the lines, how to see the shadows behind the words. It began with Craig sliding a stack of papers toward me, his hand steady in a way that told me he had already convinced himself this was for the best. He said things about protecting the children from negativity, about wanting to live free from judgment and control, words that tasted rehearsed, like phrases pulled from some therapy manual. Lynn sat next to him, her chin tilted up, interjecting now and then with remarks about boundaries and how modern families needed to redefine relationships. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at how they had taken the language of self-help books and weaponized it against the very man who had built the ground beneath their feet. Instead of laughing, I felt my throat tighten and the old ache of shame creep in. The kind of shame you feel when you realize that the people you love are no longer embarrassed to humiliate you. I asked him if this was really what he wanted, if he truly believed that I was no longer his father, and he looked away, eyes fixed on the window, as if the answer could not be spoken while meeting mine. That avoidance told me everything. He had chosen. He had already let me go long before those words reached my ears. I tried to remind him of the down payment I had given, the sacrifice that had made this very house possible. But Lynn cut me off sharply, telling me that gifts do not come with strings attached, that what I had given was appreciated, but did not entitle me to insert myself into their private lives. I wanted to shout that it had never been about entitlement, that all I had ever wanted was a place at the table I had helped build. But my voice cracked, and the words came out as a whisper, swallowed by the polished silence of that room. That was when Craig pushed a document toward me, explaining that for legal clarity my name had been removed from the property records, that the lawyer had confirmed everything was in order. He spoke of clarity and order as if he were discussing office paperwork, not the erasure of his father's place in the world. I knew then that they had gone further than words. They had acted, signed, altered, stolen. My signature, neat and slanted, appeared on a page I had never seen before, transferring my share entirely to them. I stared at it, the familiar loops of my hand, and for a fleeting moment I doubted myself. Had I signed this and forgotten? Was my mind truly slipping? But no. I knew the steadiness of my memory. I knew the discipline that had never abandoned me, even in grief. That paper was a forgery, and the realization struck with such force that I felt the blood drain from my face. I left the house carrying nothing but the memory of their rejection, and as I walked I began to understand that what had happened was not a moment of anger or misunderstanding, but a deliberate act designed to cut me out of their lives, while securing for themselves the comfort of the home I had paid for. The betrayal was not emotional alone. It was financial, calculated, and cruel. I returned to my bungalow, sat in the sagging armchair by the window where Maria once embroidered in the evenings, and let the truth settle on me like a shroud. My son had declared me dead in all but name. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated it with precision. The grandchildren, I suspected, had been told their grandfather was better kept at a distance, an old man too rigid, too judgmental, too inconvenient to be worth visiting. The seed of my erasure had been planted long ago, and now it had sprouted fully, choking out what remained of the bond between us. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the table with the documents Craig had thrust into my hands, copies, not originals, and I studied every line. The legal jargon blurred at times, but one thing became clear. My rights had been stolen under the guise of signatures that were not mine. I ran my fingers over the paper as if touch might reveal the truth. And though my hand trembled, my mind grew sharper. They thought me too weak, too senile to notice. But they had forgotten that I had spent a lifetime teaching young people how to spot lies in literature, how to see beyond the mask of words. I saw their lie as plainly as I had ever seen a plagiarized essay. My son had not only cast me aside, he had attempted to bury me under the weight of falsehood. And in that realization, something shifted within me. Not rage, not yet, but the first stirring of resolve, the kind that whispers, "You are not done, not yet." The next morning I confided in my neighbor Margaret, a retired attorney who lived 3 houses down and who had often shared coffee with me on her porch. I showed her the papers, and after only a few minutes of examination, her brow furrowed, and she confirmed what I already suspected. The signatures were not consistent. The notary's seal was suspicious. The entire transaction smelled of manipulation. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration, saying, "They underestimated you, Richard. You're still sharper than they think." Her words lit a small fire inside me. For the first time since Maria's death, I felt something other than grief and loneliness. I felt the heat of justice calling to me. Craig had said I was no longer his father, but those words, cruel as they were, became the catalyst for something he did not expect. They awakened in me the will to fight, to reclaim not only what was stolen, but the dignity he had tried to strip away. They thought they could discard me, but in discarding me, they had given me purpose. That was the irony that neither Craig nor Lynn could yet see. In trying to erase me, they had made me dangerous again. I woke the next morning with the bitter taste of humiliation still clinging to me, as if my son's words had seeped into my bloodstream and poisoned every thought that tried to take root. It was not just the sentence itself. "You are no longer our father," but the way it was delivered, so calm, so deliberate, so devoid of hesitation, that gnawed at me. The mind replays moments like that endlessly, each repetition deepening the wound, and I found myself staring at the ceiling of my modest bedroom, hearing Craig's voice again and again, until the walls seemed to close in on me. I tried to rise, to shake it off, but the truth followed me into the kitchen, where the kettle whistled like it always did, into the garden where the roses Maria had once planted leaned under the weight of their blossoms, and even into the pages of the morning newspaper where the words refused to hold meaning. Nothing could distract me, because the betrayal was total. It was not a quarrel, not a misunderstanding, but a declaration that the bridge had been burned and that I was expected to accept my banishment without question. That expectation, I realized, was the real insult, because it presumed my silence, my compliance, my willingness to slip quietly into irrelevance. By afternoon, my shame had hardened into a sharper feeling, one that carried the weight of recognition. It occurred to me that what they had done was not only emotional cruelty, but also an act of theft disguised in familial language. The documents Craig had slid across the table, the forged signature that pretended to be mine, the smug composure with which Lynn reminded me that gifts did not come with strings attached, all of it pointed to a truth more devastating than rejection. They had plotted not only to sever me as a father, but to erase me as a man of standing, to reduce me to a helpless relic who would watch his own contributions vanish into the lives of those who had decided he was no longer useful. That realization was like being slapped awake. I could endure distance, neglect, even coldness, but I could not endure being tricked into financing my own erasure. It was one thing to stop visiting me, to let my phone calls go unanswered, to whisper to the children that their grandfather was out of touch. It was another to use my trust, my money, and my name as tools to shut me out of what I had built. That was the line they had crossed, and once I saw it, I knew the story was no longer about sentiment, but about survival. The first sign that their cruelty would not end with words came only a few days later when I tried to visit the house again, foolishly hoping to catch Craig alone, away from Lynn's influence, to speak to him not as adversary and victim, but as father and son. I thought perhaps if I appealed to the boy I once held, if I reminded him of fishing trips with Maria, of evenings when I stayed up late helping him memorize speeches for school debates, he might hesitate, might see that there was still a cord tying us together that could not be so easily severed. But when I arrived, the gate was locked, and when I rang the bell, it was Lynn who answered, her voice sharp through the intercom, telling me that I no longer had permission to step onto their property. Permission, she used that word, as though I were some trespasser lurking at the edges of a world that had once been mine. I tried to reason, to ask her to let Craig come to the door, but she told me he was not available. And then, with a coldness that made my hands shake, she reminded me that legally I no longer had any claim to the house. The intercom clicked off, leaving me staring at the polished steel gate that now felt like the bars of a prison, though the man imprisoned was me, left outside. When I turned away, I noticed neighbors across the street watching me. Their expressions were cautious, polite, but I knew what they were thinking. They saw an old man shut out of a house he had once entered freely, and they wondered what shameful secret lay behind it. In that moment, I felt the sting of humiliation so sharply that I nearly wept right there on the sidewalk. But instead, I walked away slowly, determined not to give them the spectacle of my despair. Still, I carried that humiliation home with me, and it grew heavier when I found a letter in my mailbox the next day. It was from a law office I did not recognize, neatly printed, informing me that I was not to attempt to contact Craig or his family without prior arrangement, that all communication should go through their attorney. The words were polite, clinical, but the meaning was clear. I had been cut off, exiled, reduced to a problem best handled by intermediaries. They had not only declared me no longer a father, they had branded me an intruder into the lives I had financed. That was the first escalation, the tightening of the noose, and it left me trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The days that followed blurred together, but each brought some new insult, some new reminder that I was no longer considered family. Phone calls went unanswered. Letters I wrote to the grandchildren were returned unopened. A photograph of us together that once hung in their hallway was quietly taken down, and when I asked about it during a rare phone call, Craig answered in a clipped voice, saying only that they had redecorated, as if erasing me from their walls was the same as repainting. The cumulative effect of these small acts was more devastating than a single blow, for they created an atmosphere of suffocation, a slow smothering that told me in 100 ways that my existence was no longer acknowledged. And yet, in that suffocation, a stubborn flame of resistance began to glow, because I understood that if I accepted this treatment without question, I would not merely be forgotten, I would be complicit in my own erasure. One evening, after yet another humiliating attempt to reach Craig by phone, I sat at my desk surrounded by Maria's old papers. The smell of dust and time thickened the air, and I realized that I had reached the edge of something. It was no longer enough to mourn what had been taken. I had to confront the theft itself. I studied the forged documents again, holding them under the lamp, comparing the signature with others I had made through the years, noting the subtle differences only I could recognize. To any outsider, it might look authentic, but I knew the slant of my letters, the way my pen always hesitated slightly on the downstroke of an R, the rhythm that was uniquely mine. Whoever had forged it had done so with confidence, but not with my history. I felt then not only the sting of betrayal, but the insult of their arrogance. They believed I would never notice, never challenge, never rise. They thought my age had dulled me, that grief had weakened me. They were wrong. The next step came almost instinctively. I gathered the papers, put on my old coat, and walked down the quiet street to Margaret's house. She welcomed me with her usual warmth, poured me a cup of strong coffee, and listened as I laid everything before her. She read the documents in silence, her brow tightening, and then she looked up with eyes that held both sympathy and anger. "Richard," she said, "this isn't just betrayal. This is fraud, and fraud can be fought." Her words struck like a bell, clear and steady. Fraud can be fought. It was the first time since Maria's death that I felt the stirrings of strength rise in me, not from memory, but from purpose. It was as if the very act of being cast out had stripped me of the passivity that grief had cultivated. If they wanted to treat me as dead, then I would haunt them with the persistence of the living. The first escalation had come not from me, but from them, and in answering it, I knew I was crossing a line too, from wounded father to something harder, a man who would not die quietly. I walked home that night under a sky heavy with stars, each one a reminder that endurance was possible, even in vast darkness. My humiliation had become my fuel. My rejection had become my weapon. And though I still felt the ache of loss, I also felt a grim clarity. They had underestimated the power of an old man stripped of everything but the will to reclaim his dignity, and that underestimation would be their undoing. The weeks that followed became a test of endurance. I never believed I would face at this age, and though I woke each morning with the same heaviness in my chest, there was also a sharper clarity growing inside me, the kind of awareness that comes when illusions finally collapse, and all that remains is the blunt outline of truth. I had known rejection in my life, of course, colleagues who dismissed my ideas, students who mocked my insistence on discipline, even family members from Maria's side who once hinted that I was too strict. But nothing prepared me for the rejection of my own son, delivered not in anger, but in cold administrative language, followed by the silent treatment of grandchildren who once clung to my hands and begged me to tell them one more story before bed. It was in this strange twilight between despair and awakening that I found myself staring across the desk at Margaret once again, listening to her voice as she explained in patient legal terms that what Craig and Lynn had done with those forged documents was not simply immoral, but contestable in a court of law, that they had crossed into territory where my consent had been manufactured, and that the house I believed I had partly owned might still legally carry my name if I dared to test the matter. That was the moment I realized the battle was no longer confined to whispered words and humiliations at locked gates. It had shifted onto paper, into the terrain of lawyers, judges, and banks. And though I was weary, a teacher by profession and a widower by fate, I was not unarmed. I still had my memory, my clarity, and my stubbornness. And perhaps those would be sharper weapons than Craig had calculated. It was Margaret who urged me to check with the bank, to see if the mortgage Craig had taken on the property was in good standing. And when I walked into that sterile office with its smell of ink and polished floors, I did not expect to learn what I did. The young officer behind the desk looked at me with the polite pity reserved for old men fumbling with documents. But when I handed him the deed copies and my identification, his expression shifted into something more alert. He explained, almost apologetically, that the account tied to the house was not in perfect health, that payments had been missed, extensions requested, warnings issued. I felt my pulse quicken as he spoke, because I understood then what Craig had not intended me to know. He was struggling, perhaps drowning, beneath the very roof I had helped him secure, and that desperation had likely driven the betrayal, had perhaps even been Lynn's ammunition in convincing him to cut me out. The officer, perhaps sensing my rising agitation, lowered his voice and told me that if arrears continued, foreclosure might be inevitable, and in such cases, shares of ownership or liens could be purchased, sometimes by relatives, sometimes by investors. He said this as though it were a mere technical fact, but to me it landed with the weight of revelation. In their eagerness to erase me, they had overlooked the fragility of their own standing. And there, in the bank's quiet office, I glimpsed the possibility of return, not by begging for love that was gone, but by reclaiming what they had tried to steal through the very system they had misused against me. I walked home that day with a kind of fever in my blood, the papers clutched tightly in my hand, my mind racing faster than my aging legs could carry me. For the first time in months, I felt not only humiliated and cast aside, but also equipped with a weapon they could not anticipate. They had declared me dead as a father, but as a creditor, as an owner, as a participant in the very legal scaffolding of their house, I still breathed, and my breath could stir storms. That night I sat at the table, the lamp throwing a pale glow across Maria's framed photograph, and I spoke aloud to her as I once had in the first months after her passing. I told her that our son had betrayed us both, that he had chosen money and appearances over the blood that bound us, but that I would not allow her memory to be tarnished by their lies. I told her that I had found a path, narrow and dangerous, but real, and that I would walk it not for revenge alone, but for dignity, for the right to stand again without bowing my head. And as I spoke, I felt her absence more acutely than ever. Yet I also felt her presence, as if the years of marriage had carved such deep grooves into me that even death could not erase them. She would have wanted me to fight, I decided, not with fists or shouting, but with persistence, with the quiet ferocity she always said lay hidden beneath my measured exterior. The escalation came swiftly after that realization, for once you taste even the faintest possibility of justice, silence becomes unbearable. I contacted a property lawyer Margaret recommended, a stern man with silver hair and a habit of tapping his pen against the desk while thinking, and I laid before him every document, every letter, every memory of signatures and promises. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said the words that hardened my resolve. "Mr. Allen, you have more rights than they want you to believe. If foreclosure proceeds, you could acquire the house outright, and if you choose to press charges on the forgery, they will have far more to lose than you." The bluntness of his statement left me momentarily breathless, because it reversed the narrative that had been crushing me for weeks. I was not merely the old man discarded by his family. I was a stakeholder, a potential claimant, a wronged party with the law on his side. I walked out of his office trembling, not with fear this time, but with the strange exhilaration of someone who has been pushed into a corner only to discover there is a hidden door. And yet, even as this new clarity filled me, I was not blind to the cost. I knew that to pursue this path meant war, not reconciliation. It meant that Craig and I would not share a quiet meal years from now, that the grandchildren would grow up hearing one story from their parents and another from whispered town gossip about how their grandfather fought in court to take back a house. I knew it meant that the last threads binding us might snap completely, leaving me with victory but without family. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on me, and for several nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, torn between the instinct to protect my dignity and the yearning, however futile, to preserve some semblance of connection. But each morning when I rose, the memory of his words returned. "You are no longer our father." And with it came the answer. He had already ended the bond. The choice was no longer mine to preserve. All that remained was whether I would vanish quietly or stand tall as I was pushed out. The true midpoint of this ordeal came when I received a thin envelope from the bank only 2 weeks later, an official notice of arrears and impending foreclosure proceedings. The paper trembled in my hand, not from fear, but from the certainty that the path I had glimpsed was now real. I could almost hear Maria's voice urging me not to shrink, not to let them write the ending of my story. And so I made my decision. I would pursue the purchase of the lien. I would step into the very foundation of the house they had tried to erase me from, and I would do so not with apologies, but with the cold determination they had once used against me. In that moment the balance shifted. I was no longer the humiliated father knocking on locked gates. I was the man preparing to buy the very roof they lived under, the man they thought finished, but who had just found a way to rise. And though my heart ached with the knowledge that love was gone, I felt something almost like peace, because clarity, even when brutal, is better than illusions that corrode the soul. I did not expect the first counterblow to arrive so quickly, nor did I expect it to be aimed not at my finances or my claims, but at the scaffolding of my mind, as if they had decided the most efficient way to win was to declare that the man standing against them did not truly exist as a competent human being. 2 mornings after I spoke to the property lawyer about the foreclosure notice and the path it opened, there came a firm knock on my door, the kind that does not wait to be welcomed, and when I opened it, I found 2 uniformed officers and a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as a social worker from Adult Protective Services, saying they had received an anonymous report of cognitive decline, of self-neglect, of possible financial exploitation by unknown parties, a phrasing so slick with false concern that my stomach turned. I invited them in because I had nothing to hide, and I stood in my kitchen answering questions about dates, medications, my daily routines, my finances, the year, the season, the president, reciting it all with the clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime measuring words. And still I could feel the shadow of suspicion gather, because these visits are designed that way. They are not truly about proof, but about doubt. And doubt, once summoned, lingers even after the visitors leave, which they finally did, with polite smiles and a pamphlet about community resources that might be helpful at your age. I did not need the pamphlet. I needed the truth to hold. And as the door closed, I understood that Craig and Lynn had advanced to the next phase, that they would not meet me in court if they could first bury me under a diagnosis I didn't have. The second blow came in the same afternoon, in the form of a voicemail from my landlord asking me to call him as soon as possible. And when I did, his voice was tentative in a way I had never heard before, as he explained that he had received 2 separate complaints about me from concerned neighbors, alleging that I kept hazardous clutter, that I left the stove on, that I shouted at night and frightened the children in the complex, none of which was true, but truth bends easily when threaded through the fabric of fear. He said there would be an inspection, just to be safe, and I said he was welcome any time, and then I sat at my small table with the sun draining out of the room and felt a rage so clean it almost steadied me. If they intended to push me out of my rented life to weaken me before the legal fight, I would answer each thrust with documentation, witnesses, and the patience they mistook for frailty. Margaret came over with her quick lawyer's eyes and her unflappable calm, took photographs of my tidy kitchen, the neatly labeled pill organizer on the counter, the fire extinguisher within easy reach, the garden tools hung in perfect order along the garage wall, and she said in the dry tone of a woman who has watched many a petty war escalate, "Paper beats rumor. We will bury them in paper." Their next tactic was uglier because it wore the mask of moral concern. I still attend the small church Maria loved, mostly for the music and the memory of sitting beside her while she hummed the alto line. And that Sunday after service, the pastor asked if he could speak to me privately, which is never a sentence one wants to hear when one is already fighting for the right to exist. He led me to his office and spoke gently about forgiveness and family, about the way conflicts can spin out of control, about the pain grandchildren feel when adults turn houses into battlegrounds. And as he spoke, I realized Craig had come to him first, that he had shared a version of events in which the old man, me, had become obsessed with property, had threatened to take the roof from over his own grandchildren, had refused to meet him with love. I answered as carefully as I could without turning the pastor into a judge, explaining that I had not begun this with a legal threat, but with a forged signature and a locked gate, and that whatever roof my grandchildren needed would not be held together by the lie that I was incompetent or cruel. He listened, nodded, and said he would pray for reconciliation, which in that moment felt like wishing rain onto a house already on fire. The fire, as it turned out, spread into the financial underbrush, where Craig knew the terrain far better than I did. A week into the foreclosure process, while my lawyer prepared inquiries and Margaret collected notarized statements from friends and neighbors attesting to my lucidity, the bank called to inform me that someone had attempted to access my accounts online from an unfamiliar device using security questions only a family member would know, that a new credit card application in my name had been submitted with a different mailing address, and that a small loan inquiry had been made using my Social Security number, which the bank had flagged, but could not block unless I placed a formal fraud alert. I drove to the branch myself because I wanted them to see my face, to understand that the man behind the paper was flesh and will, and I sat with a young fraud officer who moved briskly through forms, while I signed and initialed and answered questions. The ritual incantation of the modern age that promises safety through bureaucracy, but delivers only a thin shield against those willing to lie. When I walked back out into the daylight, the air felt different, thinner somehow, and I understood that the contest was no longer a family dispute. It had become a campaign to erase me across systems, legal, financial, social, until only a husk remained, a man the courts would pity, but not heed. If they could have, I think they would have reached into my past and re-edited it, and in a way they tried. Because soon there were whispers that I had been a tyrant as a father, that I had humiliated Craig by demanding perfection, that I had used money as leverage to buy obedience. The kind of story that has just enough shadow of plausibility to appeal to anyone who has ever felt judged by a parent. I do not pretend I was a gentleman every day of Craig's childhood. I was the kind of father who insisted homework be done and done well, who returned essays with the margins dense with notes, who made him mow the lawn again when he rushed it, who required apologies spoken not as mumbled ritual, but as clear acknowledgement. But I also know I coached his speech team. I stood through winter winds at every game he played. I learned the names of his friends and let them wreck our kitchen with their laughter. I saved for his college when Maria and I could barely afford a vacation. Holding both truths at once, my firmness and my devotion, is what adulthood requires, and what Craig's story refused to do because it was easier to paint me as a tyrant than to admit he had chosen betrayal to cover his failures. Those failures, it turned out, were not just the missed payments and the polished lies, but something baser, hungrier, and far more dangerous. The property lawyer called me late one evening with a clipped tone that made my hand tighten on the receiver. He had found public records of short-term loans, cash advances, and a sequence of transfers that suggested gambling or speculative trading gone bad. Patterns that lined up with the months Craig's mortgage payments faltered. I thought of the immaculate kitchen, where he told me I was no longer his father, of the sleek appliances and curated art on the walls, and I saw how much of his life had been built on staging rather than substance, the appearance of wealth that needed to be fed, with new money the way a furnace demands coal. Lynn, I suspected, knew every detail, and perhaps that was her hold on him. The leverage she applied when convincing him that removing my name and cutting me off completely was not only possible, but necessary. The realization did not ease my pain. It deepened it because I understood that the boy I raised had grown into a man who chose appearance over integrity, and that I had not seen it or had not wanted to see it until the mask cracked. The day they discovered my move toward purchasing the lien, the contest shifted from rumor to open confrontation. My lawyer filed the necessary notices, and almost immediately Lynn called from a blocked number with a voice that sounded like the edge of broken glass, informing me that if I persisted, she would file for a protective order on behalf of herself and the children, claiming I had threatened them, that I had ranted outside their house, that I had followed the boys' school bus, each accusation a lie precisely tailored to create panic in a judge's mind. I told her coldly that everything I had done was documented, that I had not set foot on their property since being ordered not to, that my days were boringly traceable between the grocery store, the bank, and my garden. And then she said the sentence that made my heart pound. "You won't win, Richard, because you won't be allowed to stand." That is the philosophy of people who believe that winning is not a matter of truth, but of preventing the other from speaking. And I hung up with my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the recognition of the enemy I faced. It was not a quarrel between a father and a son. It was a campaign run by strategists who believed old men can be erased with forms and whispers. In response, we moved faster, because speed is the only antidote to manufactured doubt. Margaret arranged for a full cognitive evaluation by an independent geriatric specialist with credentials that judges like to see, and I sat through hours of tests that were both tedious and oddly affirming, reciting word lists forward and backward, tracing intersecting shapes, recalling short stories after interruptions, identifying patterns, doing simple math in my head, while the doctor watched my face for hesitation. It was humiliating and liberating at once, because I knew I was offering myself up to be measured like a specimen. Yet with each correct answer, I felt the stone of their accusation crack. The report, when it arrived, was as clean as I could have hoped. No signs of dementia, intact executive function, mood appropriate to circumstances, recommendations for continued independence with normal safeguards for age. We sent it by certified mail to their attorney with a letter that read like the drawing of a sword, and 2 days later the protective order rumor evaporated, which is how bullies behave when confronted with a wall instead of a door. Still, they searched for doors, and they found one at my mailbox, where an envelope arrived with a return address I recognized as the title company Craig had used when he bought the house. Inside was a letter, no doubt sent by mistake, confirming that Lynn had inquired about options for a quick private sale to a cash buyer, the kind of transaction designed to close before any liens or clouds on the title could be fully examined. The plan, as best my lawyer could piece together, was to sell under the urgency of foreclosure, pocket what they could, and vanish into a rental somewhere beyond my reach, leaving me to fight over ash. We moved immediately to record a lis pendens, a public notice of pending litigation that warns any buyer the title is contested, and the satisfaction I felt seeing my name attached to that legal roadblock was not petty revenge. It was the relief of a man who has managed to wedge a crowbar into the door being slammed on him. The next day, a heavy SUV idled outside my bungalow for 20 minutes, windows dark, engine low, and though nothing came of it, the message was obvious. We see you. I watered my roses until the engine finally faded down the street and told myself I would not be chased inside my life. The grandchildren became pawns next, as they always do when adults choose warfare over honesty. A carefully curated email arrived from Craig's account, though the wording had Lynn's fingerprint all over it, claiming that the boys were terrified, that they had heard I meant to throw them out, that one of them had nightmares in which I stood at the end of his bed taking pictures of the house to sell it piece by piece. And would I please, for the love of family, stop. I wrote back a long, careful reply, explaining that a house is not a home when built on lies, that I would never harm them, that I would pay for counseling if fear had taken root, that the door to my life remained open to them even if their parents slammed theirs, and I copied my lawyer because every word now needed a witness. No response came. The silence was its own accusation, and I held onto my chair as if the room were pitching, because there is a particular nausea that comes when your love for a child is used as leverage against your self-respect. At night, I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the old pipes click, and I thought of Maria, of how she would have stood with me at the sink and told me not to let them define the terms, to keep the center of the fight where the truth lives, not where their stories want to lure me. I decided I would not speak of them to anyone casually, that I would save my breath for court and for the slow, relentless machinery of process that, for all its clumsiness, sometimes grinds toward fairness if you keep feeding it evidence. We compiled everything: the Adult Protective Services visit and its closure, the landlord inspection that resulted in a letter praising my tidy home, the fraud alerts, the independent medical report, the bank's arrears notice, the Elvis Pandens, the photographs of my garden and my pill organizer, and the calendar where my neat teacher's handwriting marked appointments and billed due dates with fussy precision. I became a curator of my own sanity, and in doing so I felt a strange kind of strength. It is not glamorous, this strength. It does not make speeches or win cheers, but it endures like a beam under the weight of a house. The phone finally rang from a number I knew by heart, my son's cell. And though I told myself I would let it go to voicemail, I answered anyway, because a father is a father, even when the role has been stripped of its name. Craig's voice sounded hollow, as if spoken through a tunnel, and he went straight to the point, telling me I was destroying his life, that I was feeding lawyers instead of helping family, that I had forced him into corners he never would have entered if I had just trusted him. I listened, then asked him about the missed payments, the cash advances, the forged signature, the quick sale inquiry, each question clean and simple, the way I used to ask him to find the main idea in a paragraph, and he lashed out with the kind of anger that belongs to men who are drowning and have chosen pride over the life raft. "You always wanted control," he said. "You wanted to be the hero, the rescuer, the man whose money made everything possible, so you could remind us forever." And there it was, the resentment he had been feeding for years, dressed now as righteousness. I told him I wanted only what had been promised, the dignity I had earned, and he said the line that cut perhaps more deeply than all the others. "I stopped being your son a long time ago. I just finally said it out loud." The call went dead, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and felt the floor tilt. And then slowly I put the phone down and steadied myself on the counter until my breath returned, because grief does not end when the person you grieve is alive. It merely changes its mask. That was the point at which I realized the second escalation had achieved its purpose. It had made the fight total. There would be no soft landing, no negotiated peace in which we pretended this was a misunderstanding and met for dinner to celebrate the boys' birthdays. I accepted that the path forward was made of filings and hearings and signatures, and that the climax would not be a conversation, but a ruling. I sold a small investment Maria and I had once kept for emergencies, not because I was desperate, but because I wanted liquid certainty when the bank offered the lien. I arranged a bridge loan through a former student-turned-financial planner who, upon hearing my story, offered terms so kind I had to stop myself from weeping in his office. I met with the property lawyer and set dates in ink. I authorized Margaret to be copied on every line of correspondence, because her discipline steadied mine. And then, with everything aligned, I walked through my bungalow at dusk, turning off lights one by one, and I told the rooms what would happen next. I would buy the house they lived in, the house that should have been partly mine. I would stand in court with my back straight and my folders neat, and when the judge asked me why I had gone this far, I would tell the truth as plainly as I could, because they told me I was no longer a father, and those words did not release me from my duty to myself. On the last night before the hearing that would set the path for ownership, an envelope slid under my door, unmarked and thin, and inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 words scrawled in a hand I recognized as my older grandson's. I remember the stories. I remember you. No return address, no plea, no apology. Just those 2 simple sentences that refused the lies adults had tried to shape around his memory. And I sat down in my chair and held the note as if it were a warm stone on a winter day. They had tried to make me a ghost who muttered about property. They had tried to brand me unwell, unfit, unworthy. They had tried to push me from my rented life and into the margins where old men disappear. But the truth has a way of leaking through, even when the door is barred. And in that small note, I felt the arc of the fight align. The second escalation had bloodied me, yes, but it had also tightened my grip, cleared my eyes, taught me the perimeter of the battlefield. I slept that night with the note on the table beside my bed, and woke before dawn with a steadiness I had not felt since Maria died, because I understood that the next step was not vengeance dressed as justice, but justice without apology, and I was finally, fully ready to take it. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after months of being battered, as if the body, exhausted from carrying humiliation and rage, decides to give itself a final gift of steadiness. I rose before dawn, dressed carefully in the dark suit Maria once insisted I keep for special occasions, and tied the same tie I had worn at Craig's graduation decades earlier, remembering how proud I had felt that day, how certain I was that the years of sacrifice had led to something solid and beautiful. Now, as I slid the knot tight, that memory stabbed me with the irony that I would be walking into a courtroom not to celebrate my son, but to stand against him, not to offer blessings, but to demand justice. I placed my documents neatly into the old leather briefcase that had once carried lesson plans and student essays, and when I stepped out into the early morning chill, I whispered to Maria, as I had the night before, that I was carrying us both into this fight, that her memory would not be left at the door. The courthouse itself, with its stone columns and echoing hallways, smelled of polish and paper, and as I sat on the wooden bench outside the chamber, I felt my hands tremble, for the first time in weeks, not with fear, but with the recognition that this was the final crucible, the moment where all the whispers and rumors and humiliations would either collapse into silence or be burned away by the light of testimony. When the doors opened and we were called inside, I took my place at the petitioner's table while Craig and Lynn entered from the opposite side. They looked polished, confident, Craig in his tailored suit, Lynn in a dark dress that seemed designed to project seriousness. But I saw in their eyes something sharp and jittery, the kind of gleam that belongs to gamblers hoping the dice land their way. The judge, a woman with sharp glasses and an expression that promised no tolerance for theatrics, asked the attorneys to present their positions. And as Craig's lawyer began his opening remarks, I sat very still, listening to myself being described as an unstable old man driven by bitterness, a father who had turned against his own son out of obsession with control, a man whose claims were not about justice, but about ego. Each word was calculated to reduce me to a caricature, and though I felt the blood rise in my ears, I reminded myself that silence is sometimes stronger than protest. When my turn came, my lawyer stood with the calm of someone who has built his life on facts rather than stories, and he laid before the court the forged signature, the expert testimony confirming its fraudulence, the bank records showing missed payments, the notice of foreclosure, the lis pendens, the cognitive evaluation, the landlord's letter, the fraud alerts, all of it assembled into a tapestry not of accusation, but of undeniable sequence. Piece by piece, the scaffolding Craig and Lynn had built began to buckle under the weight of actual evidence. The judge called me to testify, and I walked slowly to the stand, carrying not only my age, but the years of betrayal etched into my face. I swore the oath and sat, and then I spoke in the same voice I had once used in classrooms when I wanted restless students to hear not just my words, but the conviction beneath them. I told the story plainly, without flourish, of how I had given my son the money to secure his house, how he had promised my place in it, how my name had been erased without my knowledge, how I had been told to my face that I was no longer his father, how false accusations had been thrown to tarnish my mind and character, how the bank had revealed the arrears, how the grandchildren had been weaponized with lies. I spoke not as a victim pleading for pity, but as a witness testifying to truth. And as I did, I saw the judge's eyes remain steady on mine, not wandering, not skeptical, but attentive, and in that gaze I felt something I had not felt in months. I was being seen as the man I still was. Craig's lawyer tried to break me, asking rapid questions about my health, my memory, my strictness as a father, trying to provoke contradictions. But each answer I gave was measured, anchored in the discipline of a lifetime spent teaching teenagers who tested every boundary of patience. At one point, he asked whether I thought I had been a good father, and I paused, then said, "I was a demanding father, but I never stopped being his father. He stopped being my son the day he lied." The words hung in the air, and though Craig shifted uncomfortably, I did not look at him because the truth was no longer a dialogue. It was a statement etched in stone. When Craig took the stand, I listened to his voice, the same voice that once called me Dad, now dressed in bitterness and self-justification. He spoke of growing up under pressure, of feeling controlled, of believing that the gift for the down payment had been wielded as a leash, and he painted himself as a man seeking freedom from a past he claimed had suffocated him. I let him speak, because even lies reveal themselves in their own patterns, and soon his narrative began to fray under the weight of the documents presented, the missed mortgage payments, the inquiries for quick sale, the forged papers. The judge's questions cut sharper than any cross-examination, and I watched my son falter, his sentences stumbling, his eyes darting toward Lynn for reassurance that never quite arrived. In those moments, I did not feel triumph. I felt a hollow ache, because every word that exposed him was another brick in the wall between us, a wall that would not be torn down in my lifetime. Lynn testified too, her tone sharp, accusing me of intimidation, of obsession. But when asked to provide evidence, she leaned on feelings rather than facts. And the judge's pen moved briskly across her notepad in a way that told me sentiment would not be enough. The climax came not in a dramatic outburst, but in the quiet gravity of the judge's ruling. She spoke slowly, clearly, outlining that the evidence of forgery was compelling, that the foreclosure was indeed in process, that my actions had been within legal right, and that my competence had been independently verified. She declared that my purchase of the lien would stand, that the property would revert to my control once the foreclosure finalized, and that Craig and Lynn would be granted 30 days to vacate. The gavel struck, not with thunder, but with a sound that seemed to ripple through my bones, a sound that marked the end of the long humiliation and the beginning of something new. I sat very still, my hands folded, feeling the weight of victory settle, not as joy, but as solemn justice. Craig turned to me with eyes wide, not with sorrow, but with fury, and I met his gaze without speaking, because words between us had already been emptied of their meaning. As I left the courthouse, Margaret at my side, the sun broke through a bank of clouds and lit the steps in a pale gold, and for a moment I felt Maria's hand on my shoulder steadying me. I had not won back a son. That was lost to choices neither I nor time could undo. But I had won back myself, my dignity, my place in a world that had tried to erase me. And though the cost was terrible, I knew I could walk forward now without bowing my head. The climax had not restored what was broken, but it had burned away the lies, leaving me with a stripped but honest truth. And that truth was enough to carry me into whatever years remained. The day I stepped across the threshold of the house, keys in my hand, and silence in the rooms where my son's family had once filled the air with noise, I felt not triumph, but a heaviness that wrapped itself around me like a shroud. The rooms were half empty, stripped of furniture, yet still carrying the faint echoes of children's laughter and the sharper, colder echoes of arguments whispered behind closed doors. The smell of their lives lingered faintly in the curtains and in the carpet. And for a moment I stood in the entryway, unable to move. Because I was not just walking into a building, I was walking into the remains of a promise I had once believed would carry me to the end of my days surrounded by family. The promise had died long before the judge's gavel. But here, in the emptiness, its corpse lay most visible. I set down my old leather briefcase, leaned against the wall, and whispered to Maria that I had come home at last, though not in the way either of us had dreamed. In the days that followed, I began the slow work of reclaiming the house, not through grand renovations, but through small acts of presence. I opened the windows wide to let the stale air escape and the fresh light pour in, as if sunlight could chase away the shadows of deceit. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, remembering how I had once imagined family dinners here, Christmas mornings, birthdays, all the simple milestones of continuity that had instead turned into a stage for betrayal. I did not try to erase those memories. Instead, I let them pass through me, heavy but real, because to deny them would be to live again in illusion, and I had learned the cost of illusions. Slowly, I brought in my own belongings, the shelves of books that had kept me company for decades, the framed photographs of Maria with her gentle smile, the roses from my garden transplanted into the soil by the front porch. Piece by piece, the house stopped feeling like theirs and began to breathe with my rhythm, my history, my endurance. There were moments of grief still, of course, moments when I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the door waiting for a knock that would not come, moments when I imagined the boys running down the stairs with the energy only children have, moments when I heard Craig's voice as it had been when he was small, calling me to watch him ride his bike without training wheels. Those ghosts walked with me daily, and though they cut me, I no longer tried to banish them. They were part of me as much as the scars, and I carried them with the solemnity of a soldier carrying medals he no longer shines. What softened the ache was not reconciliation. It never came, and I doubt it ever will, but the rediscovery of something I thought I had lost forever: peace with myself. The lies had been burned away, the humiliations answered, and though I had not regained a son, I had regained the ability to look in the mirror without lowering my eyes. That is no small victory in the twilight of a man's life. Neighbors came by cautiously at first, some curious, some wary, a few offering casseroles or spare furniture when they realized the house was now mine. I accepted politely, not because I needed the things, but because I understood that presence mattered, that to be part of a community again meant opening the door even when one's instinct was to retreat. Margaret visited often, checking on me, sometimes sitting with me on the porch as we watched the sunset. And one evening she said quietly that I had walked through fire and come out not unscathed, but unbroken. I told her I did not feel like a victor, and she nodded, replying that true victories are rarely sweet, that most of them taste of ashes, but still carry the nourishment of survival. Her words stayed with me as I planted new roses along the fence line, my hands working in the soil with the same care Maria had once shown. And when the first buds appeared weeks later, it felt like a quiet confirmation that even charred ground can bloom again. As for Craig, there has been no word, no attempt to reach me, no apology, not even an insult. Silence is his final gift, or perhaps his punishment, and I accept it for what it is. The grandchildren, too, are absent, though I keep their photographs in my study and sometimes read aloud the note my oldest grandson once slipped under my door. I remember the stories. I remember you, letting those words echo as a reminder that truth cannot be entirely extinguished, that memory has its own stubborn roots. I do not know if they will come back one day, when they are grown and able to see for themselves what really happened, but I no longer live for that possibility. I live for the mornings when the kettle whistles and sunlight spills through the kitchen window onto the table where Maria's picture stands, for the evenings when I water the roses and hear the faint hum of the town around me, for the knowledge that I endured and did not let myself be erased. The house is mine now, not because I claimed it with anger, but because I refused to surrender to the lie of my own disappearance. It stands as both a monument to betrayal and a sanctuary of endurance. And though it does not echo with the voices I once longed for, it carries the steadier echo of my own footsteps, unhurried, unapologetic, present. I know the years ahead are fewer than the ones behind, but I also know that in those years I will live as a man who held his ground when the people he loved most told him to vanish. That is the legacy I leave, not one of reconciliation, but of resilience. And as I sit on the porch in the fading light, watching the roses sway in the evening breeze, I feel Maria beside me once again, not in sorrow, but in quiet agreement. And I know that though I lost my son, I did not lose myself.